You have been at this game for over 35 years now, grinding away. I was sitting there doing the math, realizing I am 63 years old. I just looked at him and said, "Look, brother, we have invested serious money into this and we absolutely need to get a return on it now." In an incredibly rare and candid public moment, Hollywood legend Richard Gere dropped a revelation that is currently sending massive shockwaves through the elite circles of the entertainment industry and stunning his devoted fan base worldwide. When you look back at everything, just how magnificent is this current chapter of your life compared to all the rest? It is the absolute pinnacle, the top of the mountain, without a doubt. It is nothing less than perfection. She has gifted me about 7 glorious years of happiness that I never thought I would find. The man who was once lionised as the ultimate silver screen heartthrob in classics like Pretty Woman, Runaway Bride, and An Officer and a Gentleman, has stepped out of the shadows to completely dismantle the meticulously polished fairy tale surrounding his personal history. He did not point fingers or cast blame on his famous ex-wives or the string of failed, high-profile relationships that have followed him for decades. He did not attempt to hide behind the shield of his massive fame or blame the chaotic circumstances of a life lived in the public eye. Instead, in a moment of raw vulnerability, Gere admitted that the actual reason his past marriages crumbled into dust had nothing to do with the women involved. It was entirely because of him. He simply was not ready. He had no idea how to stay present. In a modern culture that thrives on assigning blame and digging up scandal, his confession felt profoundly revolutionary. Because it forces us to ask, what if love does not actually fall apart just because 2 people stop caring for one another? What if the relationship shatters simply because one of them never truly understood how to begin in the first place? It is the tragedy of a late start of finding real, authentic love. Richard Gere was once the undisputed poster child of easy charm and sophistication. He married a world-famous supermodel, becoming a darling of both serious film critics and the voracious tabloid press. He stood arm in arm with some of the most breathtakingly beautiful women on the planet, not merely as a fictional co-star, but as a real-life partner. He was the quintessential romantic lead that audiences everywhere swooned over. But for years, it appears he did not know how to switch off the performance even when the cameras stopped rolling and real life began. He confessed that during his earlier years, love felt less like an emotion and more like a project he had to manage, a situation to control, or a point he had to prove to the world. It was not until he was nearly 70 years old that the internal shift finally happened, changing his perspective forever. He finally stopped his exhausting search for absolute perfection and ceased pretending to be the character he thought a partner wanted him to be. This new relationship did not feel like another role to audition for or a reputation he needed to fiercely protect. She did not show up with a toolbox to fix him or a mission to challenge his ego. She simply stayed by his side, and for the first time in his life, that presence was enough. He referred to her as the undeniable true love of his life, not as a fleeting comment, but as a deeply held truth. He stated it with the quiet, unshakable calm of a man who no longer feels the burning need to impress a single soul in the room. This was not about Hollywood glamour fairy tale endings or sweeping dramatic moments on red carpets. This was about the hard-earned lesson of learning to love without needing the applause of an audience. And tragically, or perhaps beautifully, it took him decades of trial and error to finally arrive at this place of peace. Long before the global fame, before the flashing headlines, Richard Gere was just a quiet, introspective young man hailing from the state of Pennsylvania. He played the trumpet in his high school band, composed original music for theatrical productions, and dove deep into philosophy at the University of Massachusetts. He was certainly not born standing in a spotlight. He chased the world of theatre because it offered him a sanctuary where he could disappear into someone else's existence. From the very start, it seems he was training himself to perform not just on the stage, but in his daily existence. Blessed with striking good looks and a natural quiet mystique, he never had to work very hard to command the attention of everyone in the room. Women were naturally magnetised to him, and the leading roles seemed to fall into his lap with effortless ease. The world expected him to be the charming seducer, and he consistently met those heavy expectations without missing a beat. However, somewhere along that journey, he began to confuse the act of love with a performance. For decades, he lived out a version of romance that appeared flawless from the outside looking in. But it required the wisdom of age and periods of profound solitude to finally unlearn those deeply ingrained habits. Now, speaking as a man who once defined an entire era of romantic cinema, he no longer discusses love as if it is a scene he needs to execute perfectly. He speaks of it as something you must mature into a choice you make over and over again, not because it provides a thrill, but because it finally offers a sense of safety. It was a love that never knew how to remain stationary. Richard Gere always possessed a talent for slipping past the labels people tried to pin on him. Observers called him mysterious, intense, and even deeply spiritual. Yet when it came to his personal relationships, none of those descriptors were strong enough to hold his life together. His early romances moved at a breakneck speed and burned with blinding intensity. They were too quick, too fiery, and never steady enough to survive the long haul. There was the relationship with Carol Mallory, a stunning model, who once poetically compared him to a jewel streaking across the night sky. Then came Dawn Steele, a fierce editor at Penthouse, who would eventually shatter glass ceilings as the first woman to run a major Hollywood motion picture studio. Penelope Milford, his talented co-star from Days of Heaven, remained by his side through the majority of the chaotic 1970s. But even that connection could not endure. Then there was Sylvia Martins, the woman who shifted the trajectory of his life in a much quieter, profound way. She was the one who introduced him to the mysteries of Nepal, the wisdom of Tibetan monks, and the practice of deep meditation. Through her guidance, he discovered Buddhism, a philosophy that would later become a massive defining pillar of his personal identity. These were all brilliant, bold women with their own vibrant lives and impressive legacies. But at that stage in his life, Richard simply did not know how to offer them stability. For him, love was just one fragment of a much larger desperate search for meaning. He was skyrocketing in Hollywood with films like Looking for Mr. Goodbar. He had Days of Heaven and American Gigolo under his belt. But emotionally, he remained completely ungrounded and adrift. Caught between the glitz of red carpets and the silence of lonely hotel rooms, he lived like a man who had never learned the art of staying put. The flashbulbs were blinding. The gossip was relentless, and the celebrations often bled into the sunrise, leaving behind a haze of excess. He was a phantom, everywhere you looked, yet nowhere to be found, making him impossible to grasp and an enigma to truly understand. Perhaps that elusive nature is precisely why the romances crumbled into dust. The women eventually grew tired of chasing a ghost and moved on while he simply let them go, retreating further into his own world. It wasn't a lack of affection that drove them away, but rather a profound inability to navigate the reality of a partner who actually wanted to stay and build something lasting. However, the wind shifted in 1988 at a quintessential Beverly Hills backyard barbecue hosted by the legendary photographer Herb Ritz. Richard, then 39 years old, crossed paths with someone who would rattle his composure. Cindy Crawford, barely 22 at the time, was already a titan in the making, possessing one of the most commercially recognisable and photographically perfect faces the fashion industry had ever seen. Her career was detonating like a supernova. She was undeniably young, breathtakingly stunning, and her image was plastered on every newsstand and billboard across the country. Cindy Crawford had constructed her empire at a breakneck velocity that few could comprehend. She was the definition of youthful success caught in a perpetual state of motion that never allowed for a pause. Her life was a blur of jet setting to photo shoots, gracing high society events and fighting to maintain her own identity while an entire industry tried to sculpt her into their ideal commodity. It was far more than just modelling. It was a high-stakes game of global branding, immense pressure, and a gruelling travel schedule that left little room to breathe. She was still in the throes of discovering her own womanhood, all while frantically trying to satisfy the demands of the world. Richard Gere, in stark contrast, had already weathered 2 decades under the harsh glare of the public eye. He had grown weary of the cacophony. The allure of fame, which once might have sparked excitement, now felt hollow and no longer offered the thrill it did in his younger years. Rather than indulging in the hedonism of Hollywood soirees, he began choosing solitude. He dedicated his hours to deep meditation, immersing himself in Buddhist philosophy and engaging in humanitarian efforts far removed from the paparazzi's lens. While she was sprinting toward the pinnacle of her career, he was on a quiet pilgrimage seeking internal tranquility and spiritual grounding. Against all odds, they tumbled into a romance that left the public completely bewildered. The pairing of the seasoned brooding actor and the vibrant, fresh-faced supermodel instantly became a cultural phenomenon. They set up a life together in New York City, gracing the covers of glossy magazines and gliding down red carpets with an elegance that suggested they were genetically engineered for the spotlight. Together, they projected a level of aesthetic perfection that seemed almost too flawless to be genuine. Then in 1991, they shocked everyone by tying the knot in absolute secrecy. There was no opulent ceremony, no designer gowns, just a spontaneous trip to Las Vegas, rings fashioned from aluminum foil, and a deeply private exchange between two souls desperate to forge something concrete from the chaos. The chapel was empty of guests, and the tabloids had no headlines to run until it was over. There was only a fragile shared hope that this could work. But tranquility and ambition rarely marched to the same beat. It didn't take long for the cracks to show as their individual lives began to pull in opposite directions. Richard became increasingly obsessed with stillness and mental clarity. He would disappear into meditation for hours at a time, searching the silence for answers that fame couldn't provide. Meanwhile, Cindy remained on the treadmill of success, still in the very centre of her metamorphosis into the global icon the world demanded she become. Years down the line, she confessed that she spent those years contorting herself into the wife she thought he wanted, and in that process, she completely lost track of the woman she actually was. The end didn't come with a salacious scandal or a screaming match. It arrived as a heavy, growing silence that built a wall between them. They ceased to be partners in any meaningful sense. They were reduced to two roommates occupying the same luxury square footage, but inhabiting entirely different mental universes. Their schedules were fundamentally incompatible. Their emotional wavelengths simply ceased to intersect. The 17-year age gap became a chasm. He was pushing 40, yearning for roots and quietude, while she was still spreading her wings. She was just stepping onto the main stage of a world that felt dazzling and new, eager to experience everything he was already trying to escape. While the public devoured the images of their glamorous union, they remained blind to the reality that behind closed doors, their lives had become unrecognizable to one another. To the masses, they were admired as the ultimate power couple, but inside their home, they were living as polite strangers passing in the hallway. In retrospective interviews, Cindy would reflect that their bond lacked the foundation of true friendship. It was constructed entirely on intense chemistry and serendipitous timing, and as she discovered, timing is a fickle mistress. The relationship eventually buckled under its own unsustainable weight. In 1995, they dissolved the marriage as quietly as they had begun it, divorcing after just 4 years. There were no bitter press statements or messy court battles. The media was left without a sensational headline, only a lingering confusion over how the picture-perfect couple vanished without a sound. By that point, Richard was already transitioning into a new phase of existence, one that was far more private, introspective, and detached from the Hollywood machine. Yet, despite all his wisdom, love had not yet taught him the secret to longevity in a partnership. Nearly 3 decades later, Richard finally voiced what he had long held inside. He acknowledged that he had fallen for a woman who was still in the process of becoming herself, mistakenly believing his love could provide her with stability. But looking back, that dynamic was fundamentally unfair to both of them, placing a burden on the relationship that it was never built to carry. Following the split, Richard refused to return to the carousel of high-profile dating. There were no rebounds with new models, no splashy romances plastered across the grocery store tabloids. Instead, he pivoted, completely stepping into a lifestyle that looked nothing like the one he had left behind. He embarked on extensive travels through Asia, deepened his studies of Tibetan Buddhism, and shifted his professional focus towards smaller, more intellectually stimulating films. While his name remained legendary, his face appeared far less frequently on the silver screen. It was a quiet new beginning that felt suspiciously like the endgame he had always wanted. After years of navigating the fast lane of fame and the complexities of romance, Richard Gere believed he had finally stumbled upon true peace when he met Carey Lowell in 1995. She possessed an elegance that was rooted in reality, a grounded nature that was the polar opposite of the chaotic energy he had grown so exhausted by. Although she had once played a Bond girl, there was absolutely nothing theatrical or pretentious about the way she conducted her daily life. Richard recognised a profound serenity in her spirit, a steady rhythm that convinced him she was the anchor he had been searching for all along. They kept their romance strictly under the radar, avoiding magazine spreads and skipping red carpet appearances. They moved in together without fanfare, settling into a rhythm of domestic normalcy. In the year 2000, their son, Homer James Jigme Gere, came into the world. It marked the very first time Richard became a father, embracing parenthood at the age of 51. It wasn't until 2 years down the line that they actually tied the knot, opting for an incredibly intimate affair rather than a spectacle. You wouldn't find any flashing bulbs or paparazzi swarming the grounds. It was strictly family only as they set down roots in the quiet upscale enclave of Pound Ridge, New York. Richard effectively swapped the red carpet for garden soil, immersing himself in horticultural pursuits and philosophical texts, only surfacing for film roles that truly resonated with his soul or to champion the humanitarian plight of Tibetan refugees. Meanwhile, Carey stepped back from the glare of Hollywood, almost entirely pouring all her energy and devotion into the upbringing of their young son. To the rest of the world, they had practically vanished, becoming nothing more than whispers on the wind as they retreated behind their gates. From the exterior, it appeared to be an idyllic, serene existence shielded from the chaos of celebrity. Yet there is often a very fine, indistinguishable line between tranquility and emotional detachment. As the seasons turned, an invisible chasm began to open up between the couple, fueled largely by Richard's retreat further and further into his own spiritual psyche. He would disappear for extended periods, dedicating weeks to deep meditation at Buddhist sanctuaries or isolating himself in the most rugged, remote corners of the Asian continent. While this intense spiritual regimen provided him with the profound serenity he craved, it essentially demanded that he be alone to achieve it. For Richard, silence was a golden necessary component of existence, even within a union. Whereas Carey found that she required something far more tangible than mere quietude. She certainly wasn't looking to reclaim her status as a superstar, but she was desperate for genuine human interaction and a shared pulse in her daily life. She yearned for a partner who was actually present in the room, someone emotionally accessible and willing to engage in the mundane little moments that keep a romance breathing, but that was simply not on offer. Inevitably, their public appearances dwindled to near zero. At film premieres or galas, you would spot one of them flying solo while the other was conspicuously absent. It wasn't an explosive fallout, yet the silence was deafening, and by the time 2013 rolled around, capping off 11 years of marriage and 18 years of history, Carey made the move to file for divorce. The paperwork cited the standard Hollywood reason of irreconcilable differences, a vague term covering a multitude of private sorrows. Insiders eventually whispered that Carey had grown exhausted with feeling like a mere lodger in her own life, inhabiting the shared space without ever really feeling like she owned a stake in it emotionally. Richard remained steadfast in his pursuit of nirvana, but in chasing the divine, he had inadvertently checked out of the day-to-day closeness that his wife so desperately required. One person's sanctuary is another person's prison. What Richard interpreted as spiritual peace, Carey experienced as a cold, hollow abandonment, confusing his silence for stability. However, when the house is quiet, not because of a comfortable understanding, but because the connection has been severed, that silence transforms into a glaring red flag. It was only as the foundations of their union began to crumble into dust that he appeared to grasp that his personal tranquility had been purchased at the expense of his marriage. What followed was a 3-year marathon of legal proceedings, a prolonged period where the finalisation of their split seemed to drag on interminably. This delay wasn't fueled by screaming matches or emotional vendettas, but rather the complex and dry reality of dividing a massive fortune. Between them, Richard Gere and Carey Lowell had amassed an empire worth upwards of $45 million, not to mention a portfolio of real estate scattered across the country. Untangling such a complex web of assets required immense patience, and throughout the ordeal, both parties maintained a dignified silence, refusing to leak details to the tabloids. Despite the bureaucratic slog regarding the finances, they were completely aligned on the single most critical aspect, the well-being of their son, Homer agreeing swiftly to a shared custody arrangement. You wouldn't find any bitter custody wars or mudslinging in the press. When it came to the boy, they were entirely civil and mature. Young Homer, often characterised as an introspective and gentle soul mirroring his father's temperament, remained the calm eye within the storm of their separation. Neither Richard nor Carey ever sat down for a tell-all interview to explain the split. The relationship simply faded to black, leaving a lingering sense of melancholy. There were no scandals of infidelity, no webs of deceit, and no villains in this particular story. It was simply a tragic case of two individuals evolving into their authentic selves and discovering that those selves could no longer inhabit the same life together. Following the legal dissolution, Richard didn't try to bounce back with a blockbuster hit or a splashy public tour. Instead, he practically ghosted the industry. He was notably absent from the glitzy awards circuit, declined every press inquiry, and avoided the flashbulbs of film festivals like the plague. Rumours began to circulate that he had silently retired from acting, choosing to dedicate his remaining years to fatherhood meditation and global travel. To the casual observer, it certainly appeared as though he had closed the door on romance and relationships permanently. For a long stretch, the gossip columns had nothing to report until suddenly in 2014, while the ink was still drying on his divorce papers, Richard surfaced again. But in a surprising twist, he wasn't walking that path in solitude this time around. Observers caught sight of him in the company of Padma Lakshmi, the stunning model and culinary expert known for hosting Top Chef, though their debut was anything but a loud proclamation of love. They didn't stage any photo ops or sit down for joint magazine features. The evidence of their courtship was limited to a handful of grainy paparazzi snaps. It was mostly intimate dinners in quiet corners of New York City, fueled by rumours that they had first crossed paths backstage during a charity gala. Sources claimed they were inseparable that first evening, engrossed in conversation for hours, and subsequent meetings were equally discreet and sporadic. At this stage in their lives, both carried significant emotional baggage. Richard was still wading through the debris of his 18-year saga with Carey. Meanwhile, Padma was nursing her own wounds after the passing of billionaire Teddy Forstmann, a man who had been a pillar of strength for her and a father figure to her child. Consequently, their brief union wasn't defined by passionate public displays or headline-grabbing drama. It was simply a fleeting, gentle chapter, defined by quiet understanding and the sort of low-pressure companionship that doesn't demand the world's attention. Richard hadn't been actively hunting for a new partner, but life often brings people together when they least expect it. Yet within those fleeting, hushed months, he managed to uncover a sanctuary of sorts, finding solace in a partner who truly grasped the heaviness of a history laden with complications. Although they shared a genuine affection and enjoyed the time spent together, both Richard and Padma eventually came to the sobering conclusion that they were navigating their existences at entirely conflicting velocities. Richard was at a stage where his entire being was yearning for absolute tranquility, stripping away the noise to find the essence of simplicity. He had pivoted inward, immersing himself deeply in the quietude of meditation, spiritual getaways, and a deliberate deceleration of life, whereas Padma remained firmly entrenched in the whirlwind of the public spotlight. Caught between the demands of television hosting, international galas, and an ever-expanding media empire, her reality was spinning at a breakneck speed that Richard no longer wished to match. Their romance was a brief chapter lasting roughly 6 months, and it concluded as softly as it began, devoid of screaming matches or tabloid-fueled scandals, with insiders noting they simply decided friendship was the healthier path. There remained a deep well of mutual admiration between them, but the fundamental logistics of their daily routines and their core priorities had drifted too far apart to reconcile. Neither of them attempted to force a grip on a fading connection, and perhaps for the first time in his romantic history, Richard wasn't using affection as a crutch to escape the echo of his own solitude. He had finally ceased the habit of plugging the emotional voids in his life with new faces. Instead, he carried away a profound lesson from that era: true peace is never found by clutching something too tightly. He realised that sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing it enough room to breathe and ultimately enough space to depart when its season has passed. Following the quiet dissolution of his bond with Padma, an internal transformation took root within Richard, signalling a shift where he no longer felt the compulsion to hunt for a new partner. He refused to retreat into the artificial glitz of Hollywood as a distraction technique, and he stopped demanding that his life adhere to some pre-written script or rigid timeline. The exhausting efforts to manipulate destiny or control the future vanished, replaced by an acceptance that human connections cannot be hammered into harmony if the notes are discordant. He understood that some souls are destined to be lessons rather than lifelong fixtures, and in that serene stillness, absent the need to dazzle or chase, Richard crossed paths with a destiny he never saw coming. Enter Alejandra Silva. Their collision wasn't accompanied by the flashing bulbs of paparazzi or screaming headlines, but rather arrived with a quiet certainty. There were no press releases or dramatic declarations to the world. The universe simply aligned, bringing him face to face with Alejandra Silva in the most organic way possible. Alejandra was a complete departure from the archetype of women Richard had historically dated. She wasn't strutting down catwalks as a supermodel, nor lighting up the silver screen, and she possessed zero thirst for celebrity status. She carried her own complex narrative, a life story that was rich, textured, and far from the superficial ease often found in Tinseltown circles. Having recently navigated the choppy waters of a painful divorce, her primary focus was anchored on the upbringing of her young son and her deep commitment to humanitarian efforts back in Spain. As the driving force behind the Rice Foundation in Madrid, she was in the trenches with the homeless population, going so far as to sleep on the rough pavement herself to truly comprehend the visceral reality of their suffering. Alejandra operated on a philosophy of absolute dedication, believing that if you are going to commit to a cause, you must offer every ounce of your spirit to it. She famously noted that her charity endeavours weren't about chasing accolades. Rather, she operated on a binary principle: if she couldn't pour her entire soul into a cause, she simply wouldn't touch it. That unvarnished honesty and her reservoir of quiet, resilient strength immediately captivated Richard, who found it refreshing that she had no desire to perform for him. She was simply living her truth, executing work that mattered, and raising her child with a tenderness that spoke volumes about her character. The year was 2014 when destiny orchestrated a reunion at her family's boutique hotel in Positano amidst the stunning cliffs of the Italian coast, at a time when both were wading through the muck of personal transitions. Richard was in the delicate process of untangling himself from the remnants of his second marriage, seeking a new baseline for his life. Simultaneously, Alejandra was submerged in the legal and emotional complexities of her own divorce proceedings, yet when their eyes locked, the baggage of their histories seemed to dissolve. Instead of the past, they saw a shimmering potential for a future, prompting Richard to make the initial approach, though he did so with a grace that lacked any theatrical drama. He became a poet of patience, sending fresh bouquets daily and composing intimate short melodies alongside handwritten letters that spilled from his heart without demand. These gestures weren't designed as a sales pitch to win her over, but rather as gentle signals of his steadfast willingness to stand by her side through the storm. His silent message was unmistakable: "I am here ready to remain if you find yourself in need of a companion." Though Alejandra initially kept her guard up, acutely aware of the 33-year age chasm and his colossal fame, The last thing she wanted was to become just another footnote or a fleeting name on the extensive roster of women who had drifted through the actor's glamorous life. Yet Richard respected her hesitation completely, never applying pressure, never attempting to charm her into submission or rushing the natural unfolding of events. He simply waited with a monk-like patience, affording her all the space she required to realise that this connection was far more substantial than a temporary fling. It was a profound bond, a tethering of souls that promised tranquility instead of the turbulence she feared. And gradually Alejandra began to witness a version of Richard the public never sees. She realised that his stillness and unwavering presence were not a performance for the cameras, but the genuine fabric of his being. He was authentically invested in constructing a foundation of reality, with her proving that his actions carried far more weight and truth than any spoken promise ever could. Eventually, her heart surrendered not to his celebrity status or grand vows, but to the unshakable trust he had brick by brick built within her. They wed in April of 2018 in a hushed spiritual Buddhist ceremony in New York. Alejandra chose to convert to Buddhism not out of obligation to Richard, but because she discovered a profound resonance and personal meaning within the spiritual principles he held dear. She later reflected on their union, stating that when the karmic energy vibrating between two souls is sufficiently powerful, superficial differences fade into the background. She described the experience of meeting Richard as a moment of absolute clarity, likening it to a hand reaching into the abyss to pull her from the shadows and illuminate the path forward. Following their nuptials, the couple retreated to the serenity of a sprawling estate in Pound Ridge, seeking a life defined by privacy and nature. This was the very same estate where Richard had co-authored a life with his former partner, Carey Lowell, yet the atmosphere had completely transformed under this new union. Richard was no longer constructing emotional fortresses around his heart or the relationship. He had let go of all expectations and the exhausting need to play a specific role. They simply existed together as true companions, weaving their daily lives into a shared tapestry without the crushing pressure of having to perform for an audience. The year 2019 marked a beautiful milestone as they welcomed Alexander, their first son, together into the world, followed just 12 months later by the arrival of their second child to complete the circle. Although the couple made a conscious decision to keep their youngest name out of the tabloids, they certainly didn't suppress their elation, as Alejandra frequently treated her followers to heartwarming snapshots of their domestic bliss on Instagram. Their happiness was often found in the simplest of moments, whether taking serene strolls through nature, engaging in quiet meditation, or simply watching their little ones frolic under the golden autumn sun. It was undeniably clear to anyone watching that they were deeply content, even as they maintained a dignified silence regarding the finer details of their private existence. Richard has been known to gush about his better half, describing her as the most humorous, intelligent, sensitive and courageous woman he has ever known, someone who is fiercely certain of her own desires. He emphasises that there is no pressure for her to change, nor does he feel the burden to perform the role of the flawless husband. They simply exist together in close proximity, without the exhausting need for explanations. The admiration is entirely mutual, with Alejandra describing him as the kindest soul she has ever encountered, noting that he is far more than just a romantic partner in her life. He has embraced the role of a devoted father, making sure he is present to comfort the children as they drift into dreams, proving time and again that family is his absolute highest priority. This profound level of dedication clearly flows into his relationship with Alejandra as well, leading many to wonder and ask the age-old question precisely, how do you keep the spark of love alive? The secret, it seems, is refreshingly simple. Richard avoids the mistake of clutching too tightly, preferring instead to let their affection flourish organically, free from undue pressure or heavy expectations. Through experience, he has come to realise that the essence of true romance lies not in force, but in allowing the connection to deepen quietly and steadily as the years roll by. Fundamentally, what they share is a profound affection, constructed entirely on a foundation of deep mutual understanding. You will find Alejandra and Richard walking through life side by side, devoid of any desire for control, bound instead by a shared perspective where their bond is defined by respect for their distinct differences. Richard tends to be the contemplative one drawn to solitude and quiet reflection, whereas Alejandra provides a dynamic counterpoint with her active advocacy for human rights and her tireless work for the homeless. Their paths did not cross because they were mirror images of one another. Sameness was never the catalyst for their union. Rather, they connected because their souls vibrated to the same rhythm, a deep, steady cadence that resonated with the hidden landscapes of their inner worlds. This isn't a romance fueled by the fleeting fires of youthful infatuation, but one forged in the maturity of two souls who have weathered heartbreak and emerged with a renewed, resilient capacity for love. Richard had navigated the choppy waters of 3 divorces, while Alejandra had carried the heavy burden and sharp pain of a marriage that had fallen apart. When they finally found one another, it wasn't out of a desperate need to be repaired, but rather a recognition that they were both already complete entities. Both arrived at the realization that true love isn't about grasping possessively or holding on with white-knuckled intensity. Instead, it is about creating a space where the other person never feels compelled to struggle, just to remain present, a sentiment Richard once captured perfectly when speaking about his wife. He proclaimed her to be the most generous woman he had ever known, both in her dealings with the world and with him personally, and really that was all that needed to be said. They dispensed with the need for theatrical gestures or convoluted explanations, knowing their bond relied on something far more substantial than mere passion or duty. It was the natural result of 2 fully formed individuals coming together grounded in their own completeness rather than codependency. Neither Richard nor Alejandra looked at the other as a vessel to fill their own voids or to satisfy needs that had gone unmet in the past. Alejandra had no desire for Richard to reprise his role as the cinematic romantic hero, just as Richard did not require her to fit the mould of any woman from his history. Their bond crystallised precisely because they had both achieved a state of self-acceptance with absolutely no intention of trying to change the person standing across from them. They had reached a stage in life where there was nothing left to prove to the world, and certainly no one left to impress but themselves. Richard's displays of affection remained simple yet profoundly heartfelt, such as composing short melodies for her each morning or penning traditional handwritten letters. Gone were the concerns about media contracts or obligatory public appearances. Their life became about peaceful dinners and the joyous sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls. The true secret to the success of their union lies in the fact that neither attempts to exert control over the other's actions or thoughts. They operate without the need to monitor schedules or justify every fleeting emotion. They simply show up coexisting in a state of intuitive understanding. It is the kind of rare, liberating love that grants both partners the freedom to exist as their most authentic, unvarnished selves. Having navigated the fires of their respective past pains, they have emerged ready to cultivate something beautiful in the tranquil sanctuary they have built together. Richard, once the omnipresent face of global cinema, has retreated from the glare of the spotlight. At 74, he is no longer a fixture in the daily press. You won't find him strutting down red carpets or enduring the monotony of answering the same repetitive interview questions ad nauseum. The public often wonders what project he might be filming, unaware that he may not be working on anything at all, having left behind the chase for applause headlines and public approval. Nowadays, Richard's existence is dedicated to far quieter pursuits, finding peace, maintaining privacy, and nurturing the serene love he shares with Alejandra. The couple has settled into a wonderfully hushed existence in the idyllic town of Pound Ridge. If Richard does decide to take on a project these days, it is likely an understated independent film that requires neither the fanfare of box office analytics nor the pageantry of premieres. He has decisively stepped away from the limelight, choosing instead to while away his days with Alejandra and their 2 young sons at their farmhouse estate. There, the rolling hills are frequently draped in a mystical morning mist, and the untamed grass is allowed to grow tall, brushing past their knees in the wind. This pastoral setting provides the family with a tranquility and grounding that is virtually impossible to replicate amidst the frantic hustle of Hollywood. His daily rituals have shifted dramatically. He now delights in brewing tea or coffee for Alejandra himself, eschewing assistance to handle these small but deeply meaningful tasks personally. You might spot him walking the dog along the weathered stone path behind the house, simply soaking in the profound silence of his rural sanctuary. You won't find any relentless paparazzi lurking in the bushes nearby, nor any intrusive camera lenses tracking his every single movement. Instead, his days are now overflowing with the most understated and genuine pleasures that life has to offer. He spends his time tending to his garden, diving deep into Buddhist scriptures, gently playing the piano for his children as the evening settles in, and occasionally driving them to school in a modest older SUV. Gone are the phalanx of bodyguards and the chaotic press conferences. There are no movie scenes to shoot, just the raw and beautiful rhythm of real life as it happens. Even though he has deliberately stepped away from the blinding limelight, Richard maintains a fierce commitment to humanitarian causes, specifically dedicating himself to the plight of Tibet human rights and the homeless crisis. However, rather than delivering thunderous speeches from a podium or seeking the applause of a crowd, he prefers to toil diligently and quietly behind the scenes. He has long moved past the ego-driven need for public recognition. For him, the tangible impact of the work itself is the only reward necessary. His wife Alejandra mirrors this spirit through her tireless charitable work with the Rise Foundation in Spain, carrying forward their shared ethos of helping others without any desire for trophies or accolades. When it comes to their family life, the curtains are drawn tight. You will never see staged photo opportunities or flashy vanity-fueled posts on social media. All the world ever gets is a fleeting, simple glimpse of their existence, perhaps a candid shot of a walk through the crisp autumn woods or a Christmas card bearing a humble message. It is usually something as grounded as, "From our sanctuary to yours, we wish you nothing but peace." This quietude is a far cry from the high-profile, headline-dominating relationships Richard navigated earlier in his life, yet it is the path he has consciously chosen, one that values serenity and privacy over the hollow noise of fame. As the man himself once profoundly stated, "I do not need to be in Hollywood to know that I still exist." It has become abundantly clear that he no longer feels any dependence on the relentless Hollywood industrial machine. He did not announce his retirement with a dramatic press release or a grand statement. Instead, he simply took a step back quietly, choosing to inhabit a life far removed from the spotlight. Once globally celebrated for portraying magnetic, charming characters on the silver screen, Richard Gere now fully embraces the most significant role of his entire lifetime. It is a role that requires neither the high-gloss glamour of Tinseltown nor the constant prying attention of the tabloid press. By becoming a loving father, a devoted husband, and a man truly at peace with his decisions, Richard Gere's narrative has evolved into a journey towards something far more profound. In a world where so many are desperately chasing the spotlight, he discovered something infinitely better. A quiet existence, a genuine home, and a love that demands nothing but his presence. He did not retire with a bang or a spectacle, but rather he made the powerful choice to simply embrace peace. So now, looking back at the incredible journey he has taken, from walking red carpets to reading bedtime stories, what do you believe is the secret ingredient that makes a love story truly endure? We would love to hear your perspective, so please go ahead and share your thoughts in the comments section below.